Ranger pushed the untouched bowl away and pressed his muzzle deeper into a dead soldier's jacket. I stood outside Kennel 4 with my hand on the steel latch, listening to the soft scrape of ceramic across concrete. The rehabilitation wing smelled of disinfectant, damp fur, and the faint machine oil scent trapped inside the faded field jacket beneath him. Fluorescent light shimmered across the observation window. Ranger did not look up. Clare Bennett, the technician beside me, said, passing over a clipboard. 32, registered nurse, medical lead on evening rotation. He's yours now. The last sentence carried no relief. It sounded like an apology. Ranger was a retired Belgian Malinois, 73 pounds on intake and barely 64 that morning. His service record identified him as a military patrol and detection K9. The feeding chart showed 14 rejected meals in 6 days. Someone had circled the latest weight in red. I opened the kennel and waited for the latch to click shut behind me. Ranger's ears moved at the sound, but his eyes remained fixed on the jacket. The fabric was worn smooth at the elbows. One sleeve still held grains of pale sand in its seams, and above the chest pocket sat an empty rectangle where a name tape had once been. I lowered myself onto the cold floor 8 feet away. My scrubs tightened across my knees. The ventilation fan rattled overhead while Ranger breathed in shallow, measured pulls, as though even air had become an obligation. "I'm not taking it," I said. His eyes shifted toward me. Not his head, just his eyes. I slid the food bowl back within reach, moving slowly enough that my fingernails whispered against its glazed rim. Ranger rose at once. No bark, no exposed teeth. He simply placed one front paw on the jacket and stood between it and my hand. The movement cost him. His hind legs trembled, and his nails clicked unevenly against the concrete. Still, he held the line. That was when I understood the first rule of caring for him. Food did not matter, touch did not matter, and neither did reassurance. Only that jacket still carried an order he recognized. I withdrew my hand. Ranger remained standing until I returned to my place by the wall. Then he folded down carefully, ribs showing beneath his coat, and rested his muzzle across the sleeve. I checked his gums without touching him, counted his respirations, and watched the pulse flutter beneath the thin fur inside his rear leg. The numbers on the chart were not exaggerations. His body was shutting down by quiet degrees. I opened a packet of warm chicken. The rich smell spread through the sterile room, but Ranger turned his face away. I poured fresh water into a clean metal bowl. He ignored the ringing splash. When I shifted closer, he dragged the jacket with him, protecting it from me rather than protecting himself. "Your handler isn't coming back," I whispered. Ranger's ear tilted toward my voice. For 3 seconds, his chest stopped moving. Then he pushed his nose into the empty chest pocket and released a low sound. Not a growl, but a breath worn raw from waiting. I closed the clipboard. The recommended plan called for scheduled feeding, controlled handling, and removal of attachment objects. I drew one line through the final instruction and signed my initials beside it. If I took that jacket, I might remove the last reason he had to lift his head. If I left everything unchanged, his body might not survive the week. As I rose, Ranger's gaze followed me for the first time. Beyond the kennel wall, something small scratched once beneath the outer fence, then went silent. Ranger heard it too. One ear rose into the fluorescent light. A thin whine slipped beneath the outer fence, followed by the wet scrape of paws against gravel. I stepped through the kennel's service door and into the exercise yard, where security lights cast white bars across the chain-link enclosure. The air carried the sharp smell of wet soil and pine cleaner. Near the northwest corner, a clump of mud shifted under the bottom rail. A small brown and white puppy squeezed through, belly flat to the ground, one oversized ear folded backward. He could not have weighed more than 12 pounds. Burrs clung to his coat, and each breath made his narrow sides flutter. I stopped several feet away. Stray animals were not allowed inside the rehabilitation wing, especially near military working dogs trained to react faster than most people could think. I reached toward the radio clipped to my waistband, but a metallic click sounded behind me. Ranger had risen. He stood in the open kennel doorway with his handler's jacket hanging from his jaws. His legs shook beneath him, yet his head was higher than I had seen it all evening. The puppy took 2 uncertain steps across the cold concrete. Ranger's ears angled forward. I moved sideways, positioning myself near the gate release without blocking either animal. "Easy," I said, keeping my voice low. The puppy sneezed mud from his nose. Then he walked directly toward Ranger. My fingers closed around the release lever. Ranger had spent years trained to identify threats, hold ground, and act on commands. This creature knew none of that. He only knew that the doorway offered warmth. At 6 feet, the puppy stopped. Ranger lowered the jacket and stared at him. The ventilation fan hummed behind the wall. Water dripped from a gutter into a metal drain, each drop startlingly loud. No growl came. Instead, Ranger lifted his muzzle and drew in one long breath. The puppy crept closer, paws leaving dark prints beneath the security lights. Ranger shifted his weight. His weakened hindquarters nearly folded, but he corrected himself and moved one deliberate step to the left. The movement placed his own body between the puppy and the wind cutting through the fence. The little dog tucked himself against Ranger's front leg. Ranger looked down at him. Then he looked at me. That glance was different from the guarded stare inside Kennel 4. It was direct, almost demanding. The puppy crossed to the metal water bowl and tried to drink, but the rim was too high. His claws skittered against the concrete as he stretched his neck. Ranger nudged the bowl with his nose. Water sloshed over the edge, carrying the clean mineral smell of the facility's well. The puppy lapped from the shallow spill. Ranger watched for several seconds, tongue touching his dry nose. Then he lowered his head to the bowl and drank. Once, twice, again. I stayed perfectly still as his throat worked. He drank long enough for the bowl to scrape forward between his paws. According to the intake notes, Ranger had taken water only by syringe or under direct veterinary supervision for nearly 3 weeks. Now he stepped back before the bowl was empty and left the remaining water for the puppy. The little dog finished, turned twice against the concrete, and curled beside Ranger's chest. Ranger lowered himself with care. He pulled the faded jacket closer, but not beneath his own muzzle. Using one paw, he pushed part of the sleeve around the puppy's muddy back. The jacket that no human had been allowed to touch now covered a stranger. A gust rattled the chain link. Ranger raised his head toward it, placing his body over the smaller dog until the shaking beneath the sleeve stopped. I unclipped my radio, then held it without pressing the call button. The rules required me to report the stray immediately. Ranger's eyes remained on the yard gate, alert for the first time since his handler died. I opened the kennel door wider instead. Inside, I whispered. Ranger picked up the jacket by its collar and walked in. The puppy followed beneath his shoulder, leaving a trail of muddy prints across the polished floor. I closed the outer door behind them and turned the lock. For the first time, Ranger had chosen to leave the corner where he had been waiting to die, and the unauthorized puppy had to be gone before the morning shift arrived. The red isolation light rolled across the hallway wall as the ventilation system clicked into its midnight cycle. 2 doors beyond Kennel 4, the empty overnight exam room waited behind frosted glass, smelling of antiseptic and cold stainless steel. I checked the security camera's sweep, counted the 7 seconds before it returned, then guided Ranger and the puppy across the corridor. Ranger moved first this time. His nails tapped against the polished floor while the small dog stayed beneath his shoulder, nearly stepping on the dragging sleeve of the field jacket. Inside, I pulled the privacy shade, covered the door's narrow window with a folded surgical towel, and switched off the overhead fixture. A dim examination lamp filled the room with amber light. The puppy shook beside the cabinet, flinging muddy droplets onto my navy scrubs. Facility policy required immediate quarantine, veterinary screening, and notification of county animal control. Instead, I locked the door and turned my badge backward so its reflective strip would not flash through the glass. One night, I whispered. The puppy studied me with dark, tired eyes. "If you stay quiet, I'll figure out the rest." He needed a name for the chart I had no authority to create. Milo came to me when he climbed onto a folded towel and disappeared inside it except for one bent ear. I warmed saline, cleaned the mud from his paws, and checked him for wounds. No collar, no microchip scar I could see. His ribs pressed against my palm, but his heartbeat ran quick and steady. Ranger watched every movement from beside the door. When Milo squirmed at the touch of the stethoscope, Ranger stood and nudged my wrist away, not aggressively, just firmly enough to set a boundary. "All right," I said. "You supervise." I placed Milo on the floor. Ranger inspected him from nose to tail, then pushed the puppy back toward the towel with his muzzle. That was his choice, not mine, and it changed what happened next. From the nutrition cabinet, I took a sealed tray of Ranger's prescribed recovery food and warmed it until the room filled with the smell of chicken and broth. He had rejected the same formula hours earlier. I set the tray 6 feet from the jacket and stepped behind the exam table. Ranger did not approach. Milo did. The puppy stopped beside the dish, looked up at the larger dog, then curled against its outer edge without taking a bite. Ranger's nose lifted. He crossed the room slowly, paused over Milo, and lowered his muzzle to the food. One mouthful disappeared. Then another. The paper tray crackled beneath his teeth. I held my breath and reached blindly for the wall clock. 12:47 a.m. Ranger ate almost 4 ounces before stopping to nose the untouched portion toward Milo. The puppy licked the gravy from the edge, and Ranger resumed eating beside him. No coaxing, no syringe, no hand feeding. I opened a blank nursing observation sheet and wrote the time, portion size, water intake, posture, respiration, and proximity to Milo. At 1:06, I moved the puppy's towel 3 feet away. Ranger abandoned the tray and followed. When I returned the towel beside the food, Ranger ate again. I repeated the change once, using distance rather than separation. The result matched exactly. My pen hovered above the paper. This was no passing curiosity. Milo's presence was altering Ranger's measurable behavior, appetite, movement, attention, even the way he held his head. At 2:15, Ranger finished the largest meal recorded since his handler's death. He lay down with Milo tucked between his front legs and the faded jacket beneath them both. I photographed the completed tray, secured the observation sheet inside my locked medication drawer, and entered only Ranger's food intake into the official log. Hiding Milo had become a policy violation. Concealing why Ranger had eaten could cost the staff's trust and my authority as evening medical lead. The digital lock chimed in the corridor. Footsteps stopped outside the covered window, and a key slid into the exam room door. "Claire," the morning supervisor called. "Why is this room locked?" I looked at Ranger standing over Milo, then placed my hand firmly against the handle. "Give me 5 minutes," I said. "There's something in here you need to see." "Open the door, Claire." The morning supervisor's key turned against the lock with a hard metallic scrape. Inside the exam room, Milo lifted his folded ear, and Ranger rose over him before I could move. The air smelled of warm chicken, damp fur, and antiseptic. Amber light caught the muddy paw prints drying across the pale floor. I uncovered the window and opened the door. The supervisor entered, took in the empty food tray, then saw the puppy beneath Ranger's chest. Her eyes dropped to my reversed badge. "Tell me you reported that animal." "I didn't." I unlocked the medication drawer and handed her my observation sheet. Ranger ate 4 ounces with Milo beside the tray. When I moved Milo 3 feet away, Ranger stopped. When I returned him, Ranger ate again. She read only the first few lines before reaching for her radio. "Unknown stray in exam 2. Notify county animal control." Ranger did not bare his teeth. Instead, he lowered his head and nudged Milo behind his front legs. The supervisor backed into the hall and ordered the room cleared. Within 20 minutes, 2 animal control officers arrived through the service entrance carrying a hard plastic transport crate, a slip lead, and a microchip scanner. Cold air followed them inside, bringing the smell of diesel from their idling truck. The crate's wire door rattled against its hinges. Milo retreated until his hindquarters touched Ranger's jacket. "Give him a minute," I said. "He's underweight and unsocialized." One officer crouched sideways, avoiding direct eye contact. He placed bits of food along the floor and held the loop open. Milo sniffed once, but stayed beneath Ranger. Then Ranger acted. He picked up the jacket by the sleeve, carried it to the crate, and laid it across the threshold. Milo followed the familiar fabric. The loop slipped gently over his head. Ranger stood motionless as the officer lifted the puppy. No lunge. No bark. He only pressed his nose against Milo's muddy paw until the distance pulled them apart. The crate door clicked shut. Milo's claws scratched across plastic, fast and sharp. Ranger followed it into the corridor, each step slower than the last. At the exterior doors, his knees bent. He remained upright long enough to watch the crate disappear into the white county truck. Then he turned away on his own and walked back toward Kennel 4. The folded field jacket remained beside the transport crate, abandoned where he had placed it. I carried it after him. In the kennel, Ranger faced the concrete wall and lowered himself without touching the jacket. His ears flattened beneath the fluorescent glare. I set down fresh water. He did not look at it. The room's digital monitor began sounding a soft warning. His pulse, 86 in the exam room, fell through the 70s, then into the low 60s. I pressed my fingers against his femoral artery. The beat weakened beneath his cooling skin. "Bring the thermal blanket," I said. The supervisor hesitated at the doorway, still holding my observation sheet. Now, a technician rolled in the warming unit. Heated air filled the blanket with a dry vinyl smell, but Ranger's temperature continued dropping. 100.1 degrees, 99.4, then 98.8. His breathing became shallow, with long empty spaces between each rise of his ribs. I placed the faded jacket against his muzzle. Ranger turned farther toward the wall. The object he had guarded through hunger no longer held him. Through the kennel window, the county truck's red taillights moved toward the gate. Milo's cries were faint through the insulated walls, yet Ranger's ear twitched at every one. His pulse dropped to 54. I reached for the emergency phone, but the supervisor caught my wrist and looked from the monitor to the departing truck. "You have until that vehicle reaches the highway," she said. "After that, the puppy enters county custody." Beyond the glass, the gate began to slide open. The gate motor groaned, and the county truck rolled toward the widening strip of morning light. I pulled free of the supervisor's grip, stripped off the thermal blanket's control pack, and pressed it into the technician's hands. "Keep Ranger warm. Call me if his pulse falls below 50. My shoe struck the polished hallway hard enough to echo through the rehabilitation wing. The service door released with a heavy clunk, and cold air cut through my scrubs as I ran into the yard. Diesel fumes hung above the wet gravel. The truck's rear wheels crossed the gate track. I stepped in front of the hood and raised both arms. Brakes hissed. Gravel snapped beneath the tires, and the white bumper stopped less than 6 feet from my knees. Milo's transport crate rattled in the rear compartment. One of the animal control officers climbed out, his boots grinding into the stone. "Ma'am, move away from the vehicle. Bring him back inside for 1 hour. The pickup is complete. Once we leave this property, he goes through county intake." I held out my badge. My fingers left a damp print across the plastic. "My name is Clare Bennett. I concealed the puppy, bypassed quarantine procedure, omitted him from the official overnight log, and interfered with his removal. None of that belongs to my staff. Put every violation under my name." The morning supervisor had followed me outside. Her coat hung open over her uniform, and Ranger's observation sheet trembled in her hand. "Claire, if you make this formal, I have to report it." "Make it formal." The words came out level. No room remained to soften them. "Suspend my medical lead privileges if you need to. But give me 60 minutes under supervision. Continuous cardiac monitoring for Ranger, the puppy secured behind a barrier, no direct contact. We record pulse, temperature, respiration, posture, and response during controlled proximity." The officer looked toward the open gate. "And if nothing changes? You take Milo into county custody. I sign the transfer myself. And if it does? Then this stops being a stray removal issue and becomes a medical intervention that requires review." Behind us, the service door slammed open. The technician appeared with Ranger's portable monitor in one hand, its cable trailing across the threshold. The alarm chirped in quick, thin bursts. "Pulse is 49, he called. A small cry answered from the truck. Milo pressed his nose through the crate's wire door. The monitor's rhythm changed before anyone moved, still weak, but faster. 51. 53. Ranger could not see the truck from his kennel, only hear it. I pointed to the display. "That is why I'm standing here." The supervisor studied the numbers, then removed my access card from the clip at my waist. The edge scraped against the metal clasp. "Effective immediately, you are relieved as evening medical lead pending administrative review. You will not access medications, records, or restricted kennels without direct supervision." The empty clip struck my scrub top when she let it go. "Understood. And you accept full responsibility for the trial?" In writing. For several seconds, only the idling engine and Milo's nails against plastic disturbed the cold yard. Then the officer opened the truck's rear doors. He did not release the puppy. He lifted the entire crate, carried it past me, and set it on a rolling cart. 1 hour, he said. Crate stays locked. County staff remained present. I took the cart handle, but the supervisor placed her hand over mine. Not as medical lead, she said. As the employee whose position is under review. Then supervise me. Together we pushed Milo back through the service entrance. The crate wheels clicked over each floor seam. Before we reached Kennel 4, Ranger's monitor climbed into the 60s. Inside, Ranger still faced the wall, but at Milo's first clear whine, one paw dragged beneath him. His claws found the concrete. He tried to rise. The supervisor stopped the cart 10 feet from the kennel and started a timer on her phone. Red numbers appeared beneath her thumb. 60:00. You have your trial, she said. Now prove this is more than attachment before the hour runs out. Red digits fell from 60:00 while Milo's crate wheels settled into the grout lines outside Kennel 4. The corridor smelled of cold diesel, wet fur, and the heated vinyl blanket still wrapped around Ranger's body. His front claws scraped once against the concrete. His elbows buckled before he could stand, yet his eyes remained fixed on the small brown and white shape behind the wire door. The morning supervisor raised her phone. 58 minutes. I had no badge, no authority, and no access to Ranger's restricted records. But Ranger had already done something none of us had asked him to do. He had abandoned the jacket to escort Milo into the crate. That choice had not looked like dependence. It had looked like duty. Open his final deployment file, I said. My access was revoked, the supervisor replied. Yours wasn't. Her gaze moved from me to Ranger. Then she crossed to the secure workstation and pressed her thumb against the scanner. Blue light swept beneath her skin. Ranger's archived record appeared beneath a red banner. Controlled service material. The final entry included a helmet camera file that had never been attached to his rehabilitation notes. The supervisor hesitated over the play icon. This footage documents the incident that killed his handler. Ranger pulled one hind leg beneath himself and tried again to rise when Milo whimpered. Play it. The monitor filled with shaking gray light. Wind roared through the helmet microphone. Broken concrete crowded a narrow street, and dust turned the air the color of old canvas. Ranger moved ahead of the camera, younger and heavier, his working harness dark against his shoulders. A man's voice cut through the static. Ranger, search. The Malinois disappeared through a fractured doorway. 3 sharp yelps sounded beneath the rubble. Ranger returned, circled his handler, then ran back inside instead of continuing the assigned route. What V you got, partner? The camera followed. Beneath the collapsed stairwell, a small pocket remained between 2 slabs. Several puppies pressed together inside it, their coats powdered white with dust. Loose masonry shifted overhead. Ranger crawled into the opening and curved his body around them. His handler dropped beside him, pulling debris away with gloved hands. A warning sounded over the radio. The unit had been ordered to withdraw. The handler looked toward the street, then back at the trembling animals. We don't leave the helpless behind. He removed his own field jacket, the same faded garment lying untouched in Kennel 4, and wrapped it around the smallest puppy. Another impact shook the camera. Dust swallowed the image. Through the static came the handler's final clear command. Cover them, Ranger. Protect the little ones. Ranger flattened himself over the nest. His handler turned outward, placing his body between Ranger and the collapsing entrance. The picture jolted sideways and went black. No graphic image followed. Only radio hiss, distant voices, and Ranger barking from beneath the debris until rescuers reached him. The file ended. In the corridor, the fluorescent ballast buzzed above us. Milo pressed one paw through the crate door. Ranger's nose stretched toward it from 10 feet away. The field jacket remained near the kennel wall, but Ranger did not look back. I placed my palm against the observation glass. The answer was simple enough to fit inside one sentence. Milo isn't replacing his handler, I said. He's giving Ranger a way to obey the last order his handler ever gave him. The supervisor lowered the phone, though the timer kept running. Ranger had paid for that command with hunger, strength, and weeks spent beside a uniform that no longer contained the man who had spoken it. Now the same instinct that had kept him buried over those puppies was pulling his failing body toward Milo. The animal control officer tightened his hand around the crate handle. A recording explains the behavior, he said. It doesn't prove the puppy is medically necessary. I turned from the dark monitor to the 10-foot gap between them. Then we test the command, not the attachment. I set 2 floor markers at measured distances and asked the technician to prepare continuous readings. Ranger lifted his head as Milo's paw scraped the wire again. For the first time, the question was no longer whether he missed the puppy. It was whether protecting Milo was the only purpose strong enough to bring the old soldier fully back to his feet. Take the crate behind the partition, I told the nearest animal control officer. The wire door rattled as he rolled Milo across the first floor marker. Ranger tracked the movement with his eyes, but I gave him no command and offered no encouragement. This had to be his decision. The technician secured the cardiac leads beneath Ranger's thinning coat and aimed a thermal scanner at his inner ear. Green numbers glowed against the stainless steel card. Pulse 64. Temperature 99.1. Respirations 18. The corridor smelled of warmed plastic and disinfectant. Milo gave one sharp whine as the crate disappeared behind the solid privacy screen. Ranger's ears flattened. His gaze remained fixed on the place where the puppy had vanished, but the strength drained from his forelegs. His chest touched the concrete. The monitor counted downward, 60, 57, 53. His breaths shortened to 12 a minute, and his temperature slipped another 0.2 of a degree. Bring the crate back, I said. The officer rolled Milo into view. Ranger's head rose before the wheels stopped. Milo thrust one paw through the wire door, claws clicking against the frame. Ranger pulled his right foreleg beneath his chest, then the left. His hindquarters shook as he gathered them under himself. No one touched him. No one spoke. He stood. The monitor climbed through the 60s while Ranger crossed the 10-foot gap, one uneven step at a time. At the crate, he pressed his nose to Milo's paw and remained upright. The technician marked the reading. Pulse 72. Respirations 20. Temperature stabilizing. The animal control officer folded his arms. One response isn't proof. Then move Milo to the second position, I said. This time the crate went around the corner, out of sight and beyond the reach of Milo's scent in the moving corridor air. The absence produced no struggle. Ranger simply stopped carrying his own weight. His rear legs folded, then his front legs followed. He did not look toward his handler's jacket. He stared at the empty corner as the cardiac tone slowed. 55, 50, 47. The supervisor reached toward the warming unit. I blocked the controls with my palm. 10 more seconds. The cost of being wrong was no longer my job. It was the remaining strength in Ranger's body. At 8 seconds, I nodded. The crate returned around the corner. Milo stood inside it, braced against the wire. He barked once, a small, rough sound that struck the corridor like a command. Ranger planted both front paws. His shoulders rose. One hind foot slid across the concrete, nails scraping, but he reset it and pushed again. Then the retired K9 stood fully upright and walked past the first marker, past the second, directly to Milo. His body curved around the front of the crate, placing himself between the puppy and every person in the hallway. The monitor sounded a steady rhythm. 76, 79, 81. The technician removed his hand from the emergency cart. The morning supervisor looked down at the recorded columns. Visible, improving, absent, declining, visible again, recovering. 2 controlled separations. 2 collapses. 2 voluntary recoveries. I crouched outside Ranger's reach and slid a shallow dish of water beneath the crate door. Milo lapped first. Ranger drank beside him without being prompted, then remained standing when the bowl was removed. That puppy is not interfering with Ranger's treatment, I said. My voice carried through the suddenly quiet corridor. He is the treatment Ranger has chosen to respond to. Milo gives him someone to protect, and that purpose is the only thing we have found that makes him eat, drink, stand, and remain engaged with life. The animal control officer studied Ranger's body wrapped protectively around county property. Then he signed the bottom of the observation sheet as witness. The supervisor stopped the trial timer with 14 minutes still remaining. The medical link is documented, she said. Separation can no longer be treated as routine removal. For the first time that morning, authority had shifted away from procedure and toward the evidence Ranger had produced himself. Then the facility phone rang behind the desk. The supervisor answered, listened without speaking, and looked at Milo's locked crate. The review board has the results, she said. They want both animals held separately until they decide what happens next. Ranger tightened his stance around Milo as two different sets of custody rules closed in on them. The printer behind the nurse's station coughed out 3 pages, each warm sheet curling into the fluorescent light. The morning supervisor read the board's decision while Milo's crate sat between 2 county officers and Ranger remained inside Kennel 4, separated from him by steel mesh and 12 feet of polished floor. Milo transfers to the county rescue shelter at noon, she said. Ranger remains here under supportive care. If he continues refusing food and cannot maintain temperature or mobility, the attending veterinarian is authorized to prepare humane euthanasia. The ventilation fan rattled overhead. Ranger heard Milo scratch the crate and pulled himself against the kennel door, but his hind legs slid on the concrete. A county officer checked his watch. 43 minutes until transport. The supervisor set the papers before me. The board acknowledges your findings. It still won't place a stray in a restricted military program, and the county cannot assign custody based on another animal's medical response. I read the signature line once. No appeal would stop the noon transfer. Another hearing would require days Ranger did not have. Milo pushed his nose through the wire, and Ranger answered by standing. Not for us, not for the monitor, but for the small dog watching him. He crossed to the mesh and placed one paw against it. Milo reached through the crate door with his own. The gap between them remained 4 inches wide. What if neither animal belongs to either institution? I asked. The supervisor's eyes narrowed. Explain. Milo is eligible for immediate adoption once county intake requirements are completed. Ranger's retirement file lists private placement as an alternative to continued facility care if an approved custodian accepts medical responsibility. You're an employee here, she said. Employees cannot take custody of active patients under review. I removed the blank clip from my scrub top. The plastic edge had left a pale crease in the fabric where my badge used to hang. Then I pulled a resignation form from the administrative drawer, wrote the time, and signed my full name beneath the line marked effective immediately. The pen scratched loudly across the paper. I'm not an employee anymore. The supervisor stared at the signature. Claire, resignation ends your health coverage, your position, and your access to this program. It does not guarantee the board will release Ranger. Then call them back and tell them a licensed registered nurse is applying as his private medical custodian. I'll assume the feeding plan, temperature checks, veterinary appointments, liability, and every expense. I turned to the animal control officer. And I'm applying to adopt Milo personally. Today, he set the crate handle down. There's a fee, a home declaration, and an emergency foster waiver. The shelter director has to approve release before intake. Send me everything. The corridor filled with the dry clicking of keyboards and the smell of fresh toner. I completed the county application on one workstation while the supervisor transmitted my resignation and custody request from another. Ranger stayed upright at the mesh. Whenever Milo shifted, he shifted with him, preserving that narrow line of sight. At 11:38, the county officer's phone chimed. He read the message, opened the crate, and clipped a temporary foster tag to Milo's plain blue collar. Emergency foster to adopt approved, he said. Milo stepped out, shook from nose to tail, and walked straight to Ranger's kennel door. At 11:51, the supervisor's printer started again. She lifted a single-page release authorization. The board accepts private placement under 24-hour nursing observation and veterinary follow-up. Once Ranger crosses that door, this facility is no longer responsible for his care. I understand. The kennel latch clicked beneath her hand. Ranger came out slowly, carrying his handler's faded jacket. This time, Milo walked beside him without a crate between them. I signed the final release, surrendered my facility keys, and placed both leashes around my wrist. Behind me, the doors to my career locked with a deep magnetic thud. Ahead, the service exit opened onto cold daylight. Ranger paused at the threshold until Milo crossed first. Then he followed, weak but standing, choosing the smaller set of paw prints over the building that had prepared to let him go. By noon, no one was taking either dog away alone. But as I opened my car door and saw Ranger's legs tremble beneath him, one question remained. Could the purpose that carried him out keep him alive beyond the gate? 3 months later, morning light warmed the wooden floor of my converted garage, carrying the clean scent of cedar shavings and chicken broth. I knelt beside a low feeding stand with a stethoscope around my neck while Ranger approached from the hallway. His handler's faded jacket rested across his back, the empty sleeve brushing his side. He was still lean, but his ribs no longer showed. Milo trotted ahead, brown and white paws tapping across the boards, then stopped beside the correct bowl. Ranger waited until the puppy took the first bite. Only then did he lower his muzzle and eat. The pattern had held through every difficult night. Milo slept beside Ranger when the old K9's breathing turned shallow. Ranger woke whenever Milo cried and guided him toward water, warmth, or me. What had begun as a reason to stand became a daily rhythm. Meals, short walks, physical therapy, rest. Ranger gained 11 pounds. His temperature stabilized. The tremor in his hind legs faded from constant to occasional. The veterinarian reduced his monitoring schedule from daily to weekly, then signed the line that had once seemed unreachable: medically stable in private placement. I framed that page beside Milo's finalized adoption certificate. The garage changed with them. Rubber rehabilitation mats covered the concrete. 2 quiet kennels stood against one wall, their doors always open. A donated exam table occupied the corner where my lawn mower had once been. Above it, a simple wooden sign read Last Order K9 Recovery. The program accepted retired working dogs who had lost handlers or stopped responding to conventional boarding. County shelters sent calm, overlooked strays for carefully supervised visits, not as cures and never as tools, but as companions with choices of their own. Ranger chose his role before I gave it a name. During the first session, an aging Labrador remained beneath a bench while a shy shelter dog paced near the doorway. I reached for a leash, but Ranger rose without looking at me. He carried the faded jacket across the room, placed it between the 2 dogs, and stepped back. Milo settled on one sleeve. The shelter dog approached the other. Minutes later, the Labrador crawled from beneath the bench and rested his chin on the worn canvas. Ranger did not guard the jacket anymore. He shared it. On the afternoon, Animal Control arrived to close Milo's foster file. The same officer who had once carried his crate entered with a clipboard. His boots sounded against the wood, and Milo paused beside the water station. Ranger moved immediately, but there was no collapse in his legs and no desperation in the motion. He stepped in front of Milo, stood squarely, and looked up at me. I showed him the blue collar in my hand. A small silver tag hung from it, engraved with Milo Bennett. "No one is taking him," I said. Ranger held my gaze for another second, then made his own decision. He moved aside and nudged Milo toward me. I fastened the collar while the officer signed the final release. Milo shook until the tag chimed against the buckle, then ran one quick circle around Ranger. The old Malinois lowered his head, and Milo pressed his forehead beneath Ranger's chin. Ranger no longer needed to stand between the puppy and every door. He had learned that protection could also mean letting someone belong. I hung the handler's jacket on a wooden hook at the center of the room. Ranger watched it settle, then turned away without hesitation. Outside, late sunlight stretched across the fenced yard. Milo bounded through the open doorway, and Ranger followed at a steady walk, carrying nothing but his own weight. I stood behind them in plain navy scrubs, no facility badge on my chest, as the silver tag rang through the warm air. The puppy had kept the old soldier alive long enough for the old soldier to discover that his final order was not to die protecting the helpless. It was to keep living beside them.